Okay, so, I get a lot of questions a lot of times from newer agents about, what to do. They know about the business development that's really brought in, but a lot of the training when it comes to the actual escrow period, if you get a sale, is not covered a lot of times. And in fact, a lot of companies may have a transaction coordinator that may help with that. To let the agents actually work on more business development. But I always feel that it's really good for an agent to understand the mechanisms and what works, because ultimately the buck stops with you when it comes with your clients. So they're not going to care if a transaction coordinator forgot something or didn't do something. They're going to care that you didn't follow up with it. So with that in mind, I'd like to talk about the next steps once you actually have an escrow. Okay. So the very first thing, obviously, is once you have a purchase and sale agreement that has been agreed to, fully executed, you open escrow. Typically, it's with an escrow company or a title company, but also some states require attorneys that handle it, such as New York, where everything is handled through attorneys. With that in mind, from there, you're going to want to start the due diligence period right away. Remember, we're not playing dominoes when we're looking at due diligence, meaning we're not doing one inspection. If that inspection is good, we're going to do the next one. And then if that inspection's good, order the next one, and then finally order the appraisal if everything looks good. Due to the timing and the fact that most due diligence periods are anywhere from 21 to 30 days, you kind of have to make sure you do everything all at once. Otherwise, you're going to miss that time frame. You could potentially be out of contract. And in an up market or a market that is very active, the seller may just end up canceling the escrow, and the buyer may end up losing the deposit if they don't move forward. So with that in mind, we always talk about having a team around you, people that you trust, vendors that you trust, that you can recommend to your clients. We always recommend that you give at least 3 names for each particular vendor. So, typically your team is going to include an attorney for your buyer or for the seller, who's going to review the documents, review the items, including the survey, and coordinate with the title company as well. But it's also going to include escrow and title people that you're familiar with, that you work with, inspectors and physical inspectors when it comes to the physical inspection of the property, and then of course your environmental inspectors and surveyors. So those are all members of your team, but those are what you're looking for your due diligence. Now, depending on the type of asset, you're going to have different types of due diligence that may be required. For instance, when we talk about multifamily assets and larger multifamily commercial buildings, most lenders do not require a phase 1 environmental report. They may require an environmental survey, but that's completely different, very easy to do, and it's not a third-party entity that's doing that. But a lot of times when you're in an infill area as well, they're not going to require a survey for a multifamily home either. So keep that in mind. You don't necessarily have to do that. Now, there's nothing stopping a buyer from actually getting those reports if they want one, but you're not required to have one. So when you start looking at it, and the same is true for most cash buyers. So a cash buyer, in theory, doesn't have to do any kind of due diligence if they just want to move forward with the purchase. Wouldn't recommend that by any means, but they can still, as a cash buyer, they can still do their due diligence, and we highly recommend that they do that. In addition to that, keep in mind, like for instance, single tenant net lease properties typically don't have a physical inspection because the tenant is responsible for all the maintenance and repairs. The exception for that is if there's carve-outs and the building may be a little bit older. A lot of times you'll see a carve-out where it's a double net plus lease, where the landlord is responsible for the roof, the structural conditions. And in that case, they may want to have a roofer come out and inspect the roof just so they have an idea of the lifetime that's remaining, so they can budget and estimate when they're going to have to replace that roof. In addition to that, they can look at the structures, have a structural engineer take a look at it, and if they decide to or not. But typically speaking, let's talk about your other commercial real estate deals. What kind of inspections are going to be required? And let's assume, like most people, that it's not a cash purchase, it's going to be financed. So with financing, there are some requirements that you have to take into account and look at, because lenders are risk adverse. So they're going to want to make sure that at the bare minimum, certain types of inspections are done. So as soon as you're in escrow, the first thing you should do is, 1, make sure that the buyer gets their earnest money deposit in. Escrow will give a letter or acknowledgement to that fact, and a lot of times that is the start date or of the inspection period or so, but also the start date could also be something as simple as the mutual agreement, the last person when they last signed the purchase and sale agreement. Bear in mind, unless specifically stated otherwise, most contracts default to calendar days. So when they say 21 days or 30 days, we're not talking about 30 business days. It is calendar days. Also understand that typically speaking, and you want to verify this with any of the PSAs and your local laws, but typically speaking, if the expiration date falls on a holiday or a Sunday, it usually rolls over to the next business day. That being said, some states will just, it doesn't matter, it's that date. So it's always best to try and hit that date no matter what anyways. Because ultimately, even if you think you have an extra day, you don't want to be that person being until the very last minute reviewing your due diligence documents. So from day one, the first thing you should do is determine whether or not the property needs a physical inspection, physical condition inspection. If so, then you're going to coordinate and arrange for a physical inspector that your buyer chooses to come out and take a look at the property. At the same time, your buyer, you should be coordinating with them, with the lender, making sure that they are submitting the loan application, making sure that they pay a deposit, because most commercial lenders are going to require a deposit when they start looking at financing and start moving forward to cover their out-of-pocket expenses, such as the appraisal and everything else. Now, what you want to do though is coordinate with the lender, not just the buyer. You should be talking to the vendors as well and getting all the updates there. Don't just get all your information from the buyer itself, like, well, did you order this? Did you do this? Okay. What you want to do is confirm after you speak to your buyer, confirm with the lender that, you know what, they have the application in, or it's being worked on, or it's, where they are in the process of that. More importantly, you want to make sure that the lender orders a appraisal. Okay. A lot of lenders think they're trying to do your buyer a favor by waiting for some of the due diligence and waiting to see if they've been fully approved before they order the appraisal. The problem is appraisals take anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks. And if they don't order it right away, you may not have it in time for the expiration of your due diligence. So again, we're not playing dominoes, and your lender and your vendors need to understand that as well. The next report that's pretty time sensitive is going to be the survey. Typically speaking, surveys are going to take anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks as well to complete. Now, there are workarounds around that. For instance, if there's been a recent survey within the last year, the title company, you can verify with the title company and check with them to see if they may accept that survey with a no change affidavit signed by the seller. Essentially, the seller is advising the title company that there have been no changes in this survey, or no changes on the property itself, no new construction near it, on it, and therefore there are no changes. So typically, most title companies will accept that. One caveat, if you're getting financing, you need to make sure that the title company, the lender, is going to accept it as well. Most lenders will accept a survey with a no change affidavit if the title company accepts it. Okay, so there's a couple of working parts here that you need to coordinate to make sure that they accept it. The next item that is very time sensitive is your phase 1 environmental report. Again, takes approximately 21 days right now. You might be able to get it done in 14 days, but usually about 14 to 21 days. You can get it done, and you can actually expedite all these reports by paying extra, or the buyer can expedite it. A lot of times they don't want to do that, but sometimes to get an offer accepted, you may want to have a lower contingency time frame with the understanding that you're going to have to pay a little extra to get this going in the timely manner. So the phase 1 environmental report, all lenders are going to require this for commercial buildings if they're giving a loan on the building. So the first thing you want to do is make sure that the phase 1 companies that you are recommending to your client are approved by the lender. The last thing you want to do, order a phase 1 report and find out that that company is on a list that's not approved by the lender and it's no good. okay? So once you find out if that's the case, you want to have that ordered. A lot of times the seller may have a phase one, it may be an older phase one. Typically speaking, if it's done within the last year or preferably 6 months, we can work with the seller, and you should have this in your contracts and your LOIs that the seller will work with the buyer to have a name change or the reports rewritten into the buyer's name. So in this case, a phase one could potentially be just rewritten, or a lot of times the lender, you can ask them very quickly if one, they're willing to accept a letter from the phase one company, basically what they call a reliance letter, saying that the person who they wrote the letter for can rely on this old phase one report or older phase one report. Reliance letters can be done literally in days, and they typically cost much less than a phase one report, a few $100s versus a few $1,000s. So it is something to look into if they have one. If it's older than a year, almost no phase one company will give you a reliance letter. 6 months sometimes is the cutoff for some phase one companies or environmental inspection companies. So you want to make sure that that's going to be accepted by the actual lender and that the phase one company is willing to do that. So it's a combination of things. A lot of times the phase one company, if you do run into a problem, they don't want to give a reliance letter because for them it's $300-400 versus $2,000 to $3,000 for a new report. So a lot of times they'll push back on the reliance letter. Get the seller involved. You know, that's part of why you have that in the contract, that they're going to work with you. So they can actually report over to the phase one company, because a lot of times the phase one company will say, we can't do anything unless we get authorization from the person we wrote this report for, and usually that's the seller. So if they do that, then you can actually work with that, and the seller can push them along saying, you're authorized to give them a reliance letter, you're authorized to speak with these people. So far, we're talking about the inspections, the due diligence timeframes, what you're looking at, and these are really the minimum type of inspections that are going to be required by a lender. So, you know, you have the appraisal. Physical condition report is not necessarily required by a lender, but it should be done for the buyer's sake so they're fully aware of what they're getting into. And then you also have the survey and the environmental reports. Now, another report that a lot of buyers would get, you know, and that is, of course, your PZR, Property Zoning Report, okay? So this is a company that's going to come over and take a look at the property, take a look at the zoning, and tell you if it's in compliance and also what you can and can't do with that property as far as the zoning allowance. So a lot of people want to look at that because sometimes properties are built before the zoning changes, or they change the zoning after the property was built and the property's grandfathered in. The reason why this is important is if something happens to the building and it's destroyed, you may not be able to replicate that building, okay? And may not be able to build it and have the exact same building on that lot. So it's important to understand what is currently going on as well within that property itself. Not as important, I'd say about 50-50 on PZR reports with most of my clients. 50% of them order them, 50% don't. It's not a requirement by any lender by any means. So those are essentially the reports that are the main reports. Now we can start talking about some of the secondary reports. You know, so a lot of times, for instance, a property inspection report may come out and it's going to say, you know, property inspectors are not going to take apart equipment and verify the condition, things like that. They're basically just going to check to see if it's working, and they'll also give some comments about age and whether or not they think there's any issues. So they're going to look for stuff, meaning they're going to look for evidence of a water leak on a roof, or ponding that's on the roof, or cracks in the roofing material. It's more of a visual inspection. They're not going to take a hose up there and throw water on it and see if it leaks. But if they do notice certain things, you know, there may be some deglazing of the shingles. There may be of the flat roof area, or some other issues that they're noticing. They will call that out. Now, a good property inspector, and this is why I say it's really important to have good team members on that you understand. You know, a lot of times property inspectors want to show their value to a client. So what they do is they try and find everything wrong with the property, even though it's minor, and even though it's really something that's not anything, but they make a much bigger deal of it. And then, for instance, a lot of times they'll call out things that are, which is completely true, and that this is not to code, and that a lot of times for a buyer, the first time buyer, that scares them. Why is it not to code? Why was this not built to code? Well, the fact may be that it was built to code. It's just that the codes change. Codes change all the time, so it may not be at today's standard, but there's no requirement that you have to retrofit a building to today's current codes. Except for in California, you have earthquake retrofitting, things like that. But other than that, you don't have a requirement to actually retrofit it. So that's where you can actually be part of the conversation with them and say, well, but was it code when they built the property? So it can alleviate some of the fears that the buyer may have. Or is this something that is normal, that you would typically see for a building of this age? Okay, so these are things that you want to go into, or there may be something that could be something simple or relatively minor, that's not a structural issue, but may scare people, like if they start using big words like efflorescence. There's a lot of efflorescence that they notice, and people are like, well, what does that mean? There's water coming through the cement, it's damaging the property. Not necessarily. It is water coming through and seeping through, and it's the minerals that are being left behind, but it's not necessarily damaging the property. And that's where you really need to start asking, going into a little bit more detail with the inspectors, what does this actually mean? So you want to kind of weigh out and alleviate, and really what you're trying to do is determine what are the major issues with the property. All right, so when we start looking at the major issues regarding the properties, we're also, there may be some minor stuff that's also out there. Remember to pick your battles. If you're going to go back and you're going to negotiate, your buyer wants you to negotiate, you can't go back and ask for $200,000 off of a property if the water heater's old. That is, you have to be a little bit realistic on expectations of what you're expecting to purchase and what you're coming in. And that's really where you need to have communication with the client, but you can't have that communication if you don't understand what's actually the issues. And that's where you have to really work with your inspectors and review them. When it comes to the other reports, really, the survey itself, that's going to be part of the title review, as well as the attorneys reviewing. Taking a look, there's going to be comments on there whether or not there's an encroachment that they notice, things like that. And that's something that you do. Now, when you get the title report itself, they're going to cross-reference that. So there'll be easements that are plotted on the survey, as well as a couple other things. So the attorney for the buyer will cross-reference that with the preliminary title report to determine what can be removed off the preliminary title report, or what needs to be changed, or what additional endorsements need to be added to the preliminary title report to protect that buyer. So from there, you then of course have the last one, which is going to be the phase one environmental. Phase one environmental is pretty simple for the most part. I mean, it's 80-something pages. If you ever need to go to sleep and you're having a hard time sleeping, try and read the whole 80-something pages. Realistically though, what you're really looking for is on the executive summary page. It'll state whether there is a issue that requires further investigation. Doesn't mean that there's contamination, just that it may require further investigation. Or if there's NFA, or no further action recommended, meaning they don't feel that there's any type of environmental concerns that need to be investigated any further. So when you have all these reports, again, day one of the escrow, you should be looking at and ordering these reports as soon as you can. And when I say you should be ordering, the buyer should be ordering, not you. You don't really want to order anything. You're just going to give recommendations to that buyer. So, but part of the job during the escrow process is follow Follow up, follow up, follow up. Just because they're ordered, when they're ordered, you should be asking questions of when is the expected delivery date? What do you need? Is there anything that you need from us? And then follow up with them to make sure that they're doing and getting everything that they need. The main one to follow up with as well is if they're getting financing, the lender. Is the application in? Where are we in the process? When is it going to be submitted to committee for approval? Have they accepted a loan quote? That you're working with. What's the current status, so that you can follow up with it, but also follow up with your buyer. So, for instance, maybe they don't have the PFC personal financial or PFS personal financial statements to the lender in time. You can follow up and say, hey, they really need this personal financial statement before they submit the loan. When can you get that to them? Mark that date. Follow up with the lender. Did the buyer get it to you? If they didn't by that date, follow back up with the buyer. Your job at this point is really to keep everything moving along and moving forward, and making sure that the reports and inspections that your buyer wants, they get in a timely manner, so you don't have to extend the escrow. Okay. The last thing you want to do is try and extend the escrow or extend the due diligence time frame without having a really good reason. Like maybe your investigation's uncovered something that requires further investigation. That's a good reason to extend the due diligence period. Not so good reason, my buyer didn't order it until the 15th day and it's going to take another 3 weeks to get it. Most sellers are not going to do that because they're also weighing the motivation of the buyer. Is your buyer motivated to close this escrow? What are they doing to put this all in place and getting it? And if you're on the seller side, you should be doing the exact same. Understanding the time frames, but also making sure that the buyer is moving forward and performing for all of it, that they've ordered these reports. When do they expect it? When's it coming in? And then you can follow up too, so that you're not surprised and you can convey this also to your client. The whole idea is you as the agents should understand and know exactly what's going on with your escrow at any given point in time. If there are tenants in place, you want to make sure that your estoppels are getting done right away. A lot of times the leases don't require that the tenant sign the estoppels or return the estoppels for 14, 21 days. I've seen as high as 30 days. Or if there's a ROFR, right of first refusal, you want to make sure that that gets out to the tenant right away so that they can release it. So those are the things that you want to take into consideration when you're looking at all of these deals and transactions. You as the selling agent want to follow up on the tenant side for any kind of things like the ROFR or the estoppels, making sure that the seller is getting them. You shouldn't be the one doing it. The seller should. So you're not going out to the clients with an estoppel certificate with the tenants and saying, here, can you review this and sign this? That's instead going to be a seller's job or their property manager's job. So just make sure that everything is aligned. Don't play dominoes. Order everything all at once. And you shouldn't have any issues during the escrow process. So any questions?